Hi again and welcome to this course, or this section rather. But we'll continue discussing Black's sidelines on move 2. And now we'll take a look at the move knight f6, which is called the Sicilian Nimzowitsch Variation, or the Nimzowitsch-Rubinstein Variation. But mostly it's called Nimzowitsch. So again, it's a hyper-modern idea. Black basically mixes the Sicilian Defense with a touch of the Alekhine Defense. So again, there are some similarities with the Alekhine. So Black provokes us to advance our e-pawn, and hoping he can exploit that later by opening the center with d6. Black lets White occupy the center and gain space. So, on the higher level games, this move is mostly played as a surprise weapon. To be frank, the move knight f6 is not very good for Black. But at the same time, you need to know how to deal with it, and you need to have some ideas on how to play against it, because otherwise it could be a dangerous surprise weapon for Black. So Black's idea is, after knight c3, he just defend his pawn. Then besides the normal move d6, he can also play d5 and head for a position with which is basically uncharted yet, and it's out of the book. So after d5, e5, I can play knight e4 or knight fd7 with the idea to capture on e5 if White takes d5. But anyway, after knight f6, the most critical approach for White and the best move by far is e5. Again, this is very principled. If Black lets us attack his knight with tempo, then why not? So Black plays knight d5. And here White has many moves, but the best line for him, I believe, is knight c3. And this is the line I'm recommending. So White challenges the knight from the outpost on d5 immediately, and now Black has a choice. Should he take on c3, or should he defend the knight by playing e6? And we'll take a look at those moves accordingly. Let's take a look at knight takes c3 first. So this is Black's other main possibility besides e6. After knight takes c3, we take with the d-pawn. Because if we take with the b-pawn, then we need to spend a further tempo on playing d4, and our pawn on c3 could become vulnerable to attack. So we take with the d-pawn, and this is a very good option, because we get a close pawn structure, but we can quickly develop our pieces, our bishop. In many lines, we can even consider castling long after bishop f4, queen d2, and long castle, for example. Here after d takes c3, Black's main move is knight c6. He can try d5, but this freeing move looks premature. Because after taking en passant, very important move, because otherwise Black has no problems, so we have to take en passant. Black takes en passant. So after this structure, this will rise to a position similar to the Petrov defense, knight c3 variation, but Black has played this ugly move c5, and after bishop c4, the d5 square is weak, and our bishop is very well positioned on this diagonal. So here after bishop c4, White is clearly better. We're ready to castle short next move. Meanwhile, on move 5, Black can also play e6. But again, we continue with the same ideas in the main line. We put our bishop on f4. And this is the best place for the bishop, because we prevent Black from opening up the center with b5, and our bishop protects the e5 square. So it's the best place for the bishop. And this has been played in the recent game Dimitrov against Tapinsky, where Black played b6. B6 is not a very good move because it doesn't attack the pawn on E5 and it allows white to play this very strong move knight G5, activating the knight and threatening to play queen H5 next move to put pressure on black's position. For example, after bishop B7, white plays queen H5 attacking the pawn on F7, and after G6, queen E2, we provoke black into weakening his inside dark squares. So, like in the French, we almost always want black to play G6 with the pawn on E5 because now its dark squares are weak. And the game continued knight E4. Black had to take on E4 because of the threat of a knight check. But after long castle, white has the two bishops and pressure on the D file. And white's position is close to winning in the game after G3, H4, preventing G5, and bishop G2. And after queen E3, black's position is terrible. And in addition, he has no counterplay, because if he plays knight A5, then just B3, taking control of the C4 square. And yeah, black is doing very poorly. So B6 is not a very good move here. So let's analyze knight C6. So with this move, at least black puts pressure on the E5 square. And then again, we play bishop F4, supporting our pawn wedge on E5 and also putting extra pressure on the D6 square. So this is the best place for the bishop. Here black's main move is E6. Alternatively, he can try D5, but this move is not very good, not to be recommended, because again we capture en passant, takes. Now the pawn on D6 is vulnerable after queen D2. With the idea of castling long. Now the pawn D6 under pressure. Black's king is stuck in the center. For example, if black plays D5, this move looks nice because it supports the center. But after knight G5, black is undeveloped and the bishop on E6 is under attack. And after bishop D6, G3, white has a small but clear advantage. After queen F6, takes queen E3. Black's pawns on the center are quite vulnerable. For example, if castle, we play F4 to guard the pawn on F2. Now the pawn on C5 is hanging, and additionally, we have a target on E6 after bishop H3. So after queen E7, bishop H3, followed by rook E1, this position is clearly in white's favor. Black has no counterplay, and his pawns in the center are vulnerable. So after queen E3, black can try D4. This has been played in the games Pasov against Molde. But after C takes, queen D2, our bishop is stronger than black's knight, and black's light squares are quite vulnerable. For example, after rook A8, bishop C4, and white has some edge based on the fact that black's pawns are quite vulnerable, and our bishop is stronger, since black always has to watch out for his light squares. On move 8, black can play bishop E7, but after long castle, the pawn on D6 is under attack, and he can try queen A5, but after bishop C4, putting pressure on this diagonal. Now bishop D5, we have an outpost on D5, and in the game Merkowski against Geisler 2018, white got this position, and black is able to develop and keep his pawns together at the moment. But after rook E1, white has a stable advantage thanks to the powerfully placed queen on D5, and the rook E4 is one threat here. When we have strong pressure along the open E and D files. So on move 6, besides D5, black can play queen B6 with the idea to provoke us to weaken our queenside dark squares by playing B3. So this move is a typical move. I've also faced this move myself many years ago when I think the strong Russian grandmaster Alexander Rachmanov has played this move a few times. He's played against me, but he's also played it a few times before and after. So, after queen b6, black attacks our pawn on b2, and he hopes to provoke us to play b3. And b3 is not such a bad move, but if we play b3, then the pawn on c3 becomes quite loose. So instead of playing b3, and black can probably attack it queen a5. So instead of b3, I recommend instead the move rook b1, solidly protecting our b pawn, and meanwhile we don't weaken our squares. If black plays queen c7 to attack our pawn, then we play bishop d3, followed by castling short, and again we get this setup where after e6, short castle, black is behind in space, and our pawn on e5 is well supported. We've finished our development. We're threatening knight g5 in some lines. For example, if black plays b6, then we play knight g5, and we have an extra space. So this position is playable for white. For black, but nevertheless I think he is worse because knight g5 is coming. Meanwhile on move 7, if black plays e6, white has this very strong move knight b2, with the idea of knight c4, taking advantage of black's queen's position on b6, where we can gain a tempo by playing knight c4. And the knight is very well placed here, where it protects e5, and it can jump to d6, forcing black to give up his dark square bishop. For example, if b5 then check, then black lost the bishop. And after queen g4, black's kingside is suddenly very vulnerable. So black cannot castle because of the pin bishop h6, very annoying pin. And if black plays king f8, then after bishop e2, followed by short castling, black's position is vulnerable, his dark squares are very weak, and he's unable to castle. So probably black's position is playable, but nevertheless, it's clearly difficult to defend his cause at the moment. So let's now go to the main move e6. This is the main line. Black just wants to develop. The move knight g5 here is not possible because black can take the pawn on e5 and protect f7. And if we take on e5, knight on g5 is hanging, so we can't play that right away. So here white has a choice. You can continue developing normally with queen d2, with the idea to castle long, and this is also not a bad choice. I think white is better here also. For example, in one game black played h6, but after h4 we prevent him from expanding on the king side. And now h5 is a nice move, gaining space on the king side. And in one game black played a6, and c4 prevented him from expanding on the queen side too. And after bishop e2, followed by rook h3, we get this positional sort of setup where we have more space thanks to our advanced pawns. And now we can improve slowly the position of our pieces behind it. And now king f1, with the idea to artificially castle. And our rook is very well placed on h3, defending the squares on the third rank. And black's position is playable, but he is behind in space. After king g1, white is slightly better. We're following the game Milde against Sileika, and their game continued bishop e2, and black is unable to develop his kingside pieces at the moment, and he is behind in space, so white should be better in this complex position. I must mention here though on move 10, c4 is an important move, not allowing black to expand on the queen side. because otherwise black plays b5, and then he gets space on the king side, so we don't really want that to happen. Well, move 7, my main recommendation here is the strange move knight d2, which is not as common, but it's a very interesting move too, because we want to bring our knight either to c4 or to e4, most likely to c4 to keep the e5 pawn protected, but we want to bring our knight there and control the e5 square. Later our knight can jump to d6. So after knight d2, if black plays queen c7, this is nicely met by knight c4 when white has more space, and we want to play queen g4 next move. After b5 check takes, black has lost his dark squared bishop, and after bishop e3, white has the bishop pair, and black's dark squares are weak, and in addition the pawn on c5 is pinned. So on move 7, black can play d5 here and take advantage of the fact that the d-file is not protected at the moment. But after e takes, if black plays e5, this runs into the very unpleasant move queen e2, using the pin on the e-file, and with the idea to castle long. And our threats along the d-file with knight e4 are not to be underestimated, because white develops a fast initiative after castle knight e4 takes, and our knight on e6 is very well placed, and now both of black's pawns on c5 and f4 are hanging, and white has a large advantage. So after d5, he takes d6. Black can take on d6, and this looks a lot more natural because black develops a piece. So we play queen f3, bringing our queen out to the open, developing it, and preparing to castle long. So for example, black has a slightly better pawn structure at the moment, but after long castle, we're going to have nice pressure along the d-file. For example, takes, and after long castle, white has the initiative, and yeah, in addition our pieces are a lot more active than black's. We can play bishop d3. For example, after b6, with the idea to develop a bishop, white plays bishop d3, attacking this pawn, and now bishop b7 actually loses by force, thanks to concrete tactics. Check. Knight e4, attacking the black queen, and threatening knight g5. Check. And black is lost. If he goes here, then mate is unstoppable, unless black sacrifices the queen. If black moves his king here, then after h4, threatening h5, black's king is in a very difficult spot. And after h5, white has a winning attack, thanks to this concrete move knight e4, when black is probably going to be checkmated along the h-file. For example, even after his best move king g6, check, and now rook h1, and here the very important move queen h2, threatening mate and keeping the knight d6 resource available. So here, black has to take on d6 and sacrifice his queen, otherwise queen h8 mate is unstoppable. Meanwhile, if black plays f5 here, on move 23, then white wins thanks to queen h8 and queen h5. And if black plays king g8, then knight g5 is a winning move for white. So the attack on the h-file is extremely strong. So we finished discussing this move knight takes c3, which is a solid move, but at the same time after takes, followed by bishop f4, white should have the better position. Black can play knight c7 on move 4, but this is too passive as black has wasted too much time moving the knight. And after d4 and queen takes, queen e4. The queen on e4 is a very stable position, and it controls a lot of squares from e4. For example, d5 loses due to e takes d6, followed by bishop f4 when white has a decisive lead in development. So on move 4, let's now take a look at black's main line, the move e6, which, let's see, e6 is black's main move here. And yeah, and black's idea is to take control of the d5 square. And he wants to play knight c6 next move and develop pieces very quickly. The problem is after takes, we play d4. And black's pawns on the d file are doubled, and they could quickly become a target. So, yeah. So yeah, after d4, black's pawns are vulnerable on the d file. Black's main idea is to play knight c6 and sacrifice the pawn d5 for activity. Because if he plays a move like d6, it looks very passive, and after check, we quickly develop our pieces. And after short castle, black is under some pressure in the center. And after bishop e7 with the idea to castle short, and now we can take on d6. And then we get this isolated queen's pawn structure where black is passive and slightly worse. Bishop e3 is coming, and after castle, bishop e3, followed by c3. White takes control of the d4 square, and black's position is playable, but at the same time it's quite passive, and black is worse. For example, after h3, bishop h5 runs into g4, improving our position and forcing the black bishop back. And now after queen b3 with the idea of rook a d1, white has some edge. The pawn on d5 is isolated, and it can run into some difficulties, or it could be a target after rook a d1 next move. So after d4, black's main line here is knight c6, attacking the pawn d4, and now the critical approach for white is take on c5, and after bishop takes c5, sorry about that. Instead of bishop takes c5, I also want to mention this move queen a5, but this move simply doesn't work because we just play c3, and black protects the pawn on d5. But after bishop e3, queen a5, black's position is very bad. In this position, white has a number of good ways, such as b4, or even bishop f4, to take control of d6 square. So this move on move 7 is simply very bad. And so we take on c5. And after bishop takes c5, white's critical move and the only way to try to refute this variation is by taking the pawn. So we have to take on d5. It does require you to know a little bit of theory, but at the same time, the refutation of a sacrifice can only come from accepting a sacrifice. So we have to take the pawn. In one game I played bishop d3 with white, but it's clearly a second-rate move. So taking on d5 is a critical choice, and now black's main move is d6. And this is his best defense. So d6 with the idea of bishop e6. Black has other tries here on move 8, but they're not very good. The other main reply is queen b6, attacking the pawn on f2. And you need to know how to deal with this move, but at the same time, it's not very good. But I must mention that the lines get very concrete. So after queen b6, it's not so easy to defend the pawn on d2 because we don't really want to play queen d2 as that is a passive place for the queen. So we play bishop c4, very strong move. So instead of defending the pawn, we create a counter attack on the pawn on f7. And yeah, black can take the pawn on f2, but after king e2, with the idea of rook f1, it turns out that even though black regained his pawn, he's only helping us develop our pieces. And after rook f1, now the bishop again has to retreat. So black lost a couple of tempi, moving the bishop back and forth. And now after bishop c5, knight g5 is the strongest move for white here. And it's very concrete. But the idea is of course to try to give checkmate and take this pawn on f7. So black usually plays knight b4 with the idea to blockade. But alternatively, he can try knight e5, sacrificing a piece. But if you take the piece, black goes d5 with the idea of bishop g4. And you can analyze this line further. But I believe taking the knight on e5 leads to unnecessary complications. Because, yeah, bishop g4 and then the rook on a8, the queen's rook immediately comes into play with rook ae8, rook ad8. So this line is unnecessary. After knight e5, we take on f7 instead. Black cannot take on c4 because he gets mated. So he has to take. Rook takes f7. White has other moves here such as bishop e3. And then turns out the king on d3 is very safe and black has some problems on his back rank. But I think rook takes f7 is simple and good. Why not? Because after rook takes f7, black's only move is queen e6 to trade off this queen and prevent him from getting checkmated. So takes. But I think this endgame is clearly better for white. Well, first of all, black's pawn structure is permanently worse. He's got an isolated pawn. And in addition, after bishop f4, with the idea of bishop e5 or rook f1, white has a lead in development. And after bishop e5, our dark squared bishop becomes extremely strong on that square. So, after bishop f4, followed by rook f1, this endgame is worse for black. King e7, bishop d3. White attacks these pawns here. And now bishop e5, g3, and black can defend the pawn on g7. But after a3, with the idea to start advancing our queenside pawn majority, black can try to defend this endgame with accurate play, but he has to be careful, and white has a stable edge. So knight takes e5 doesn't fully equalize. And in addition, knight b4 looks more natural because black wants to play knight e6 next move. We play king d1, putting our king in the safest square possible. Black plays knight e6, attacking our knight, and he wants to develop next move by playing d6 and activating his bishop on c8. And now we play knight e4, and this line has been played in a number of games, and it's pretty much forced for both sides in a way. Unless black wants to try knight takes e5 2 moves ago. But after knight e4, we attack the c5 square, or the bishop on c5. We take control of the d6 square, and black has some problems developing. Now the best move for black in the main line is d6, opening up the d file, and hoping to activate his slice for bishop quickly. If he plays bishop e7, black is actually threatening knight c7 to force our queen back, but this runs into some problems after knight d6. So, after bishop e7, knight d6, if you take a quick look, black's entire queen side is stuck. So the bishop on c8 is stuck, the rook on a8 is stuck. and therefore black has some problems because his position is cut into two. If black takes on d6, then we just recapture with the e-pawn. And we get this position where black is unable to develop his queen side. Meanwhile, for white, we can activate our queen's rook quickly by playing the move a4 next. And then after a4, we're turning to gain space with a5. And in addition, we can activate our queen's rook very quickly on the third rank by playing rook a3. So, the plan with a4 and rook a3 is very strong and very fast. Black can play queen c6, hoping to trade queens. But after knight f5 attacking the bishop, rook e8, it turns out this strong move queen d3. I mean, white has other good moves here, but queen d3 is the strongest. White keeps the queens on the board in preparation of a strong kingside attack. So our knight on f5 is extremely powerful, and bishop d5 is a threat. For example, if black takes on g2, preventing us from playing queen g3. If black takes on g2, then black is a pawn up. But after bishop e3, with ideas to play rook g1, or to play knight h6, followed by rook g1, pinning the black queen. And at the same time, we vacate the c1 square for our king, so we can play king c1 and safeguard our king this way. But now black has to worry about how to defend, because knight f5 is very strong. And if he plays bishop f8, this loses for black. According to the computer, the only defense for black is queen takes h2, grabbing a second pawn and threatening a third pawn on e5. But after the reply queen d5, white's position is still totally dominating, and black is hard pressed to defend because rook h1 is a threat, trapping black's queen. The knight on e6 cannot move as the pawn on f7 will be hanging. And white is clearly better here after queen d5. Bishop f8 loses because after rook g1, the attack on the g file is strong. Knight h6 is a threat, and if he plays here, then king d2. And the rook comes to f1. Rook f1, white brings the entire army towards the king side. Rook f2, so many arrows, but white has many ways to win, and the black's queen is trapped on h3. Bishop d5, rook g3, and black resigned in the game Benedote against Matex because after queen h5, bishop f3, the queen on h5 is trapped, and if he takes on f5 takes, he cannot recapture as the g pawn is pinned. So this line is clearly very dangerous for black. Let's now take a look at d6, which is the main line. Black opens up the d file and activates the light squared bishop, so he sacrifices a pawn, but in return he wants to develop. Now rook d8, bishop d7 with the idea of bishop c6 leads to a position after takes bishop e3. Black can head into an endgame thanks to queen takes c5. Queen takes b2, by the way, loses due to bishop d4. Meanwhile, it's take bishop c4. Then after rook f4, we get this endgame where the position, the opposite colored bishops promises black some drawing chances, but white is a pawn up, and we have a strong extra pass pawn on d6. Meanwhile, after e takes, rook d8 is the main line, but after bishop d3, white closes the d file, and in addition, yeah, so bishop d3 is very nice, but closing the d file, making our king feel safer. And in addition, now we're threatening queen h5 to attack black's vulnerable h7 and f7 pawns. So after takes queen h5, black's king side is weak, and he has to defend very accurately. Black's main line here is f5. to try to close up some diagonals. Alternatively, black can play bishop c7, pinning our bishop on d3. But after takes king h8, white is a pawn up. Things are still quite concrete. And but fortunately, black is not hurting anything at the moment. He just wants to develop his bishop by playing bishop d7. And now I recommend the very strong and accurate move a4 with multi-purpose idea. So one idea is to play a5 to gain space and attack the black queen. And the other important idea is to activate our queen's rook with rook a3. And after our rook is on a3, this would help defend our king on d1. So a very typical idea and very nice in this variation, a4 with the idea of rook a3. So quite an important move. Is bishop d7, and now bishop d2, threatening bishop c3. If black takes, then bishop c3, and we have an attack along the g file or along the diagonal towards g7. Meanwhile, after knight c5 takes, and now the accurate move king c1, bringing our king into safety. White plays rook a3 next, and we are simply a pawn up. Meanwhile, the bishop on d3 is well placed, and our bishops are looking good. Bishop e6 takes, and now rook e1, and black is a clean pawn up. And black has some background problems. Black cannot play rook e8 obviously, because we just take that. So in this position, white is a clean pawn up. And in addition, black cannot take the pawn h2 because of rook h3. Meanwhile, we just unravel and consolidate our extra pawn. On move 17, f5 is more accurate, with the idea to block white's kingside attack. So after f5, we take the bishop on d6. And queen f5 attacks the pawn on h7. And black has to play knight f8, and this is the best move. Alternatively, black can try queen h2, which looks very bad because black defends the pawn, but at the same time his queen is quite far away from action. So after queen h2 check, white has this very strong move bishop g5, and black is close to losing actually. Most likely black probably missed this move in the game, but the point of bishop g5 is that we attack the black rook, and if he takes, then he has some problems with the back rank after queen f8. So he has to play rook g8, and now we just play bishop e3. Black's rook is very passive now on g8, and in addition, the rook is passive here, and in addition, black's queenside pieces are still needs to be developed. And white is in fact close to winning here because black's king on h8 is very vulnerable. Our bishops are very strong. For example, queen takes g2 is met by king c1, getting the king out of the way and preparing to play queen h5. The immediate queen h5 doesn't win here because after knight f8, black defends the pawn on h7, while at the same time he's threatening bishop g4 in check. So unfortunately it doesn't win. King c1 threatens queen h5, winning. And after queen h2, rook f2. This has been all played in the game Mueller against Old Ratty. Black's kingside is just too vulnerable. Now after queen h4, his dark squares on the king are extremely weak, and white is a pawn down, but the attack is winning. There's no real defense for black because the dark squares are weak, and after rook h1 it's basically lights out. Meanwhile, our king is safe as black doesn't have enough pieces around it. So king b2, and all our pieces are working together towards the attack. And after bishop d2, followed by bishop c3. White's attack was too strong in the game, and now black is completely lost. So yeah, so this queen capture on h2 is too weak. It's too risky. And after bishop g5, white wins in all lines, almost by force. If the rook plays rook d8, then he lost a tempo. And now king d2 with the idea of bringing the last rook into the play. For example, if queen takes, then rook s2, followed by bringing the rook on the queen's rook to the game, either on h1 or on g1. Alternatively, if queen e5, then again rook s2, with the idea of rook h1. And black's king is just too weak. He has to sacrifice the exchange, because there's no other way to protect his pawns on the king side. Keeping in mind that knight g5 loses because of queen f8 with background mate. Takes, c takes, and again black has some background problems, meaning he cannot take on b2, because if he takes on b2, then after king d1, black has some background problems, and he cannot take on h1 because of queen e8 and mate. And if queen d2, then our king runs away. Sorry, not king e2 on moves 28, but just a simple move bishop c1. Yeah, king d1, and then after queen b1 check, bishop c1, and black cannot move the bishop because the knight on e6 is hanging, and meanwhile queen e8 is a powerful threat, and if black takes on d3, this loses due to the move rook d2. So this variation is quite forcing, but black is doing poorly in the game. Underwood takes, black play bishop a6. But after d4, everything works out well for white. Takes again leads to mate with queen f8. Meanwhile, after check, king d1. Followed by queen f5. In the game, queen b3 was played, but after queen c2, black was able to transpose into the endgame. But nevertheless, after rook h5, followed by rook e5, white has an extra exchange, and the endgame should be winning for white in the long run. For example, after bishop d5, white has to move bishop g5, attacking black's rook, and he has to keep an eye on the back rank. So after queen f5, knight f8 is the best move for black. And this has been played in some games. Yeah, in a handful of games. And white's best response against knight f8 is giving a check, forcing the black king to move. And after king h8, queen f4 is very strong, forcing a trade of queens, after which black is simply down a pawn. So this has been played in a handful of games. Queen f4, and black has to trade queens, because if he moves if he plays queen e7, then we just hunt the queen down with queen g5. And if black doesn't want to trade the queens, then after bishop d2, we activate our dark square bishop with bishop c3, and black is simply down a pawn. Meanwhile, after takes, black is down a pawn in the endgame, and after king e2, followed by bishop e3, we are easily able to consolidate, because we take control of all the possible squares of the knight. And after rook king d2, white is a pawn up, and our rooks are active. So white is a clean pawn to the good, and the pawn on d3 can be defended with the move rook e3. And so this is the best that black has in this line. In the end, he's still worse. Alternatively here on move 8, besides queen b6 or d6, black can try to move queen a5 check. And the idea is simply to try to win our queen by playing bishop takes f2 with check. So just watch out that you don't fall for the trick. But the simple response, queen d2, followed by queen f4, keeps the extra pawn, and we are ready to develop next, for example after bishop d3. Meanwhile, if black plays knight b4 here, on move 10, attacking our pawn on c2, then white has a number of good moves, but the simplest is probably just king d1. With the idea to kick the enemy knight back next move. And black is unable to regain the pawn because bishop takes f2 hangs the knight. And knight takes c2 doesn't work because after takes, we can block on the c file by playing queen c4. So queen a5 on move 8 doesn't really work. Black's best move here on move 8 is d6, opening up the diagonal for his light squared bishop and threatening to gain a tempo. So we take, and now at the moment we're 2 pawns up. Of course, black can capture pawn d6, and he plays queen b6, attacking the pawn on f2. So after queen b6, white's best move is queen e4, giving a check. Excuse me. Bishop e6. And here my recommendation is to move bishop c4, attacking the bishop on e6. So this rarely played move is my recommendation, and I think it's the simplest response to this variation. The main line here in this variation is queen h4 to defend the pawn on h2 and to prevent black from castling long by taking control of the d8 square. So here after queen h4, bishop takes e6, white is a pawn up, and he also tries to consolidate his position with bishop e2. Bishop d3 runs into knight b4 when our light squared bishop is attacked, and black gets some compensation for the pawn. Meanwhile, after bishop e2, bishop f5 attacks the pawn on c2, and after c3, castle, followed by rook e8. This has been played in a few games. White played bishop c4, attacking the pawn on f7, and black is unable to play rook e4 because of bishop f7 when king takes runs into knight g5. Meanwhile, after bishop g6, rook e1, this has been played in the game Bolignano against Watson, queen g3, and rook e1, and white is able to consolidate with precise moves. Takes, queen g4, and black plays rook d8, and black has some compensation for the pawn thanks to his control over the open d file. So for that reason, on move 11, queen h4 is not exactly clear cut. So I think bishop c4 is simpler, even though this move is lesser known. So I believe bishop c4 is enough to guarantee a small but stable advantage. First things first, queen b4 doesn't win a piece, because after knight d2, we keep the c4 square protected. So black takes on f2, otherwise we just castle short, and then we're safe and sound. So after bishop c4, black has to take on f2, check. And then white plays the move king d1. So the king is away from the e file, and so we just place our king here. And next move we want to take on e6 anyway. So let's see what black can do. If black plays queen b4, pinning our bishop sideways, we have the nice reply d7 check, forcing the black king to move. And if he plays king f8, and after b3, white remains a pawn up. And meanwhile, the bishop on f2 is misplaced, and we can get a strong attack after next move, rook f1. So after d7, black should probably take the pawn, but we can take on e6 with check, and that's the difference. So take, and now after c3, we get this endgame where white has a clear and stable advantage Thanks to our better pawn structure, black has an isolated pawn on e6, and white is ready to play rook f1 next to kick the enemy bishop, and then probably bishop f4. Our pieces are coming out very quickly, and white has an easy plan of advancing our queenside pawn majority with b4, etc. So black is worse here. Long castle seems more natural, but we take on e6 with check. So after bishop takes, black cannot take on d6 at the moment, so he has to capture the bishop. And here you shouldn't take the poison pawn on e6, because it might seem tempting to just take, you grab a pawn. But after king b8, black has a lot of threats along the d file and along the e file. And this looks very dangerous for white. For example, d7 runs into takes, when black gets the queen in return for 2 rooks. And our king is very vulnerable, and here black has a strong attack after queen f6. So after f takes e6, white's best move is c3. Preparing a safe hiding place for our king on c2. So this is a very important little move, and is the main point of this variation with 11 bishop c4. So white plays c3 with the idea of play king c2. Also, it takes control of the d4 and b4 squares, so it prevents annoying knight checks. So after takes king c2, material is equal, but we have the better pawn structure because e6 is isolated, our queen is in a very nice position e4, and our king on c2 is safe at the moment. So after king c2, let's see what black can do. He can play queen b5, activating his queen. But after bishop f4 attacking the rook, and black played e5. And here in the game, Rimkus against Lukasova, instead of continuing as what white played, I like the continuation bishop d2. So again, we have a nice solid blockade on e4, and our queen protects all the necessary important squares. So after bishop d2, we can develop the rest of our pieces next. For example, after rook d8, rook here, black has no threats. And now a4, gaining a tempo attacking the black queen. And if black plays queen c5, then bishop g5 is a nice move, attacking black's rook. And now b4, forcing the black queen to move, and again black has no attack on our king. And in the endgame arising after queen d5 takes, we play rook e1, preventing black from advancing his e-pawn. And so we blockade this pawn, we play rook e4, and white has a large edge in the endgame. Meanwhile on move 17, if black plays queen d5, then again we take this queen, and then we kick the enemy bishop away, forcing him to retreat. And then after rook e1, white has a stable edge in the endgame, thanks to the isolated pawn on e5. And also now, we can start pushing our queenside pawns. We can play rook e4. And white has a stable and secure advantage. On move 17, black can play rook e8, but I'm not exactly sure what it does. And after rook f1, we force the bishop to retreat, and again, this position is better for white after king b1, thanks to the blockade on e4, and white has a clear and stable edge. So after rook takes king c2, black can play queen c5 here, threatening knight b4 to trade some pieces. But again, bishop f4, attacking black's pawn on e6. And if black plays queen d5, then again we get the same structure, where we have a better pawn structure, and the pawn on e6 is isolated. And after rook e2, followed by rook e1, white has a stable and solid advantage. Later we can start advancing our pawns on the queen side, and white is better. So after bishop f4, black should play e5, and now we accept the pawn, sacrifice. The point is that bishop d2 here is not as good because after knight d4, the c pawn is pinned, and black is able to equalize after eb4. So after bishop f4, e5, I believe we can grab this pawn. And black can try to get some compensation, but after queen takes d5, queen c6 is not the way to cut it, because after check and rook f1, we force the enemy bishop to retreat, and then we get this position where our knight on f3 keeps everything protected, and white is a clean pawn up because rook d1 is coming next move. So on move 18, after queen e5, black should probably take, but after knight takes, again white is up a pawn, and rook e8 with the idea to invade on the e-file is met by rook f1, attacking the bishop. If black takes the knight, then we get a rook endgame, where white is a clean pawn up. Meanwhile, if he plays bishop h4, then after knight c4, gaining a tempo attacking the rook on d6, white has a small endgame advantage. For example, if he plays rook c6, rook f4, keeps everything protected at the moment. And now king b3, and our knight on c4 is extremely well placed. Rook d1, activating our rooks, and after rook f7, white was able to regain the pawn. But after h4, we have strong pressure along the 7th rank, and in addition, we have an easy plan of advancing our queenside pawns and playing a4, a5. So white has some initiative in this endgame thanks to our active rooks and well-placed pieces. Meanwhile, on move 21, black can play rook e2, check, and this is probably more testing. After king b3, rook b7, g3, black is a pawn down and he has to play accurately to try and equalize. If he plays bishop f6, then a4 secures the c4 square for our knight, and black is clearly worse in the endgame. So he has to find the move b5 here, attacking our knight. And this is black's best defense, but after g takes, b takes e4, king a3, white has a small endgame advantage, as the pawn on c4 is quite vulnerable. And even after black's best defense, rook e6, with the idea to harass the king with rook a6, rook f2, we get this endgame where rook c7 doesn't work here, by the way, because rook c7 protects the pawn on c4, but this loses because of rook f8 and a4, and white is merely a pawn up, and after rook b6 we can hide our king to the a3 square. So this doesn't work for black. So his best move is just recapturing the pawn, but after king takes, rook a4, and now his idea is that after b4, rook a3, he gets some counterplay on the c pawn, and throwing chances. But instead I recommend king b3 and rook e1, and we activate our rook along the e-file, and our rooks are more active than black's, and we have a queenside pawn majority, so white has some slight chances in this rook endgame. So, yeah, in addition to get this far, black has to play very accurate moves. So now we've finished discussing the Nimzowitsch-Rubinstein with knight f6. So again, I think this variation is secondary, but at the same time, after e6, white has to know what they're doing in order to get the advantage and to put pressure on black's position. Of course, white has some alternatives, but I think the line I recommended in this video is the strongest for white. And in addition, this variation is mostly played as a surprise weapon for black. So it could do well to review some of the lines here because they're long lasting, and you probably won't face this variation too many times in practice. So thanks for watching this section, and I'll see you in the next one. Good luck in your games.